Pulsar Module is a brand new company for me. I haven't tried any of their other plugins before this, but I'm definitely going to check out the rest of their lineup after this one because it's really good. They reached out to me about checking out this new Sidecar plugin that they're coming out with. They were curious to kind of get my take on it because they'd watched some of my other videos on how I mixed through my API console and kind of did a hybrid workflow. So we're going to do a little bit of some A/Bing between how I usually mix with my API and my hybrid kind of chain on my mix bus, and then do a little bit of comparing with their Sidecar. But more, I just want to focus on the Sidecar specifically because, you know, a lot of people are going to see the API aspects of the Sidecar and want to do direct comparisons. But after I've played around with this for a week or so, I think it's worth kind of thinking about as its own thing because it really is capable of being an all-in-one plugin that can cover all of your mix bus needs. It's roughly designed around the analog signal chain from an engineer named Marc Daniel Nelson. A lot of you have heard of him. I've heard of him. I've seen a lot of his other videos. He's got a bunch of great gear. So one of the cool things that he's got in his studio is an old vintage API Sidecar, which kind of puts my API console to shame. It's pretty cool. I've been lusting after it after seeing some pictures. But so it's kind of got some stuff built into it based around his API Sidecar and how he sums into it. And it's also got a bunch of other things built into it. So let's just go ahead and take a look at this plugin. So this is it. This is a Sidecar module. So they're going to come out with the P455 Sidecar, and they're also going to release the EQ inside this plugin separately as well. So if you just want the EQ part, you can have that too. So there's some options. So if you take a look at it, we've got kind of the top part is the global, what they're calling the global part of it. And so you've got the input and bias, which are kind of at the beginning of the circuit. Now the cool thing about input is if you hold shift, it's going to automatically adjust your output for you. So you can kind of just in the spur of the moment, kind of figure out where your sweet spot is when you're driving the whole circuit and, you know, get pretty close and then fine tune from there if you need to. So I think I had my input about right there. Bias kind of interacts with input as well. I'd encourage everyone to check out the manual to kind of get into the nitty-gritty. But the first thing to take a look at is this 2-channel option and the 8-channel option, because this is kind of the beginning, kind of the summing aspect of the plugin. So the 2-channel option is what most people would relate to a normal stereo bus summing plugin. This works very similar to how my API analog console is set up, because with the API box console, all of your color is coming from the master section. It's kind of just the 2 bus is just, you know, 2 transformers, 2 op amps, and that's kind of where all your color is coming from. All 16 channels of the summing section on my console are completely clean, and there's no groups on it. So as far as a direct comparison is concerned, if you go to the 2-channel, it's mimicking how most newer summing amps or newer consoles are kind of set up, to where all your color is coming from the 2 bus and there's 2 channels. Now it's also got this 8-channel option, which again, it's mimicking Marc's analog API Sidecar that's vintage. And you'd have to ask Marc on how he does this specifically, but from what I gather, it's probably very similar to how I'm working, but it would be the equivalent of how on bigger API consoles like the 1608, you have groups, you have stereo groups. So you can send your faders to stereo groups, which have transformers and op amps in them. Then the groups will go to the master section, which also has transformers and op amps. And if you want a little bit more of a deep dive into that as far as API is concerned, I've done a whole series on comparing some UAD plugins to the API consoles, and inside that video, I actually did a shootout between my box console and my friend's 1608 console where we fed things through the groups as well. So if you're curious about how the APIs function specifically, take a look at that video. It's the part 3 video. but very similar layout. And it's very cool that Pulsar is giving you the option to do that. So you can just kind of do a little bit cleaner of a summing approach and stick to the 2-channel, or you can kind of get really, really dirty and colorful and combine 8 channels of summing and get a much different tone. So those are very conveniently laid out on a switch. So you can switch between those two and hear the difference. So that's kind of your starting section as you start summing into it. From there, we have the EQ section. And again, this is available in its own separate plugin. Now, the first thing to take a look at on the EQ is all of the filters, because it sounds like Pulsar put a lot of effort into designing all the filters. And I know a lot of people kind of ignore filters because they just think, oh, I turn this on and it's just kind of cutting the top and bottom of my waveform at the top and bottom, low end, high end. The filters sound really good on this. One thing that I played around with a lot was I ended up boosting at 20K, but also hitting the filter on the 20K. And as well as the low end, I was boosting at 40 and I ended up having a filter at 20. So when you start engaging filters and boosting at the same time, you end up with some really unique curves. And if you looked at it on a scope, they'd look pretty funky. But I think, in my opinion, you know, it's one of those things where you just kind of use your ears and play around with it. But it's kind of like a guitar amp where stuff starts interacting in interesting ways. Encourage everyone to check out the filters in combination of, you know, cutting and boosting. So after the EQ, you have the compression area at the bottom. This isn't really a very technical compressor where you're really going to dig in and problem solve with it. This is a really colorful compressor, and Pulsar kind of points out that you can go anywhere from like a cleaner API kind of compressor all the way up to something that's a little bit more grabby, like a Fairchild. Now you notice in the compression section that there's just a single LED light that kind of gives you an idea of how much you're compressing. I think it's important with this compressor to kind of use your ears and just, you know, kind of hit it until it sounds good. You've got that visual reference there, but if you want to get a little bit more technical, if you move to the top of the plugin, they've actually got a gain reduction meter up here that'll tell you exactly what's going on. So just depending on how you're going to use it, you know, it's good to have. But again, I'd encourage everyone just to use their ears. 2 different ratios. One is like a 2-to-1, and I think the other is like an 8-to-1, somewhere around there. You've got your side chain that kind of tells the compressor to ignore your low end. And the only other thing on the compressor is that another thing that you can play around with when you start gain staging is the output. Every step of this plugin kind of gives you points where you can gain stage in and out of it to drive the whole thing differently, because there's a lot going on. So one thing that Pulsar encouraged people to do was play around with the output, and if you want a compressor that's going to act a little bit more clean, dial down the output on the compression side, compensate on the output at the end of it, or vice versa. If you want to get a lot more colorful with your compression, drive the output and compensate by dropping the output at the end of the plugin. The last 2 things before you get to the output stage is called analog and line amp. You've got 2 dogs. I love dog stuff. Dusty's usually hanging out with me in the studio, and it sounds like Marc's got a few dogs that hang out with him too. In a nutshell, these are kind of your digital converters, and one of them's a little bit more clean and one of them is a little bit more colorful. So you have those 2 at a quick kind of switch that you can switch between. Line amp. Now this seems very simplistic because it's just a knob. You turn it on or off, but man, makes a huge difference. Pulsar is not very specific about exactly what's going on in the line amp, but what it is, it's kind of a combination of a lot of things in Marc's studio that contribute to his analog color. So I mean, tubes, transformers. When you switch that on, it adds a significant amount of weight. So again, that's one that you can kind of turn on and off and play around with. So that's an overview of the plugin. Obviously, you've got the output at the end so you can compensate and gain stage however you need to. But that's a simple overview of the plugin. I just want to dive in and just listen to stuff. So again, we're going to do a little bit of a comparison between my analog workflow that's hybrid, that combines the console and some plugin stuff on my master bus. And we're going to compare that to just the Sidecar plugin and kind of get an idea of how things differ. Because at this stage, there are some API aspects to this plugin as far as summing and things go, but I don't want to make this a direct comparison of, you know, how close does this plugin sound to an API console. This plugin is much more capable of doing a lot of things than just my console on its own. So the plugin's much more versatile, but at the very least, I want to show you that this plugin is more than capable of hanging with a bunch of really nice expensive analog hardware. So we'll do a little bit of an A/B between my analog setup and the plugin, but other than that, I'm just going to do some more direct comparisons of some different options on the plugin. So let's move to that. So the first audio examples I want to play for everyone is kind of what I'm calling the baseline. The Sidecar plugin has a lot kicked into it. I mean, it's got summing, it's got EQ, it's got compression, a bunch of other stuff. I mean, for a lot of you, this will probably be able to replace a lot of other plugins you have on your mix bus, and you'll be able to just use this for the most part. I didn't have a problem working that way. I found it completely capable. So you've got that option to where you can go completely in the box mixing through the Sidecar plugin. The way I normally work here is kind of a hybrid workflow. So I've got my API box console and I send stems into that as I'm mixing. So I've got the summing and the sound of the API console, which is very similar to the Sidecar. And then I've got an API 527 compressor that's built into the console. I usually have that on as well. That comes into Pro Tools, and then on that channel inside of Pro Tools, I usually have a Universal Audio Channeler Curve Bender EQ over my whole mix, just to give me a little bit of a boost on top and maybe a boost on the bottom as well. So we're going to hear three examples. We're going to hear the settings that I chose on the Sidecar plugin that I like the most for the mix. We're going to hear that. Then you're going to hear two analog prints as well. The first one is going to be everything summing through my console with the API 527 compressor. And then you're going to hear that Channeler Curve Bender EQ over it as well, just boosting a little bit on top and a little bit on bottom with very, very similar settings I used on the Pulsar Modular plugin. Second example, same thing, we're going to feed into the console to get the summing, but instead of the API compressor, I'm going to have my Heritage Grandchild compressor over the mix bus, which is a tube Fairchild style. The API compressor is a little bit punchier, it's quicker. Fairchild's the opposite, it's a little bit slower, grabbier. So because, again, the Pulsar module compressor in the Sidecar is very versatile, it can do anything from like a quick punchy API to a slower, grabbier kind of Fairchild thing. So I want to give you some options to hear as far as how I would choose to set up my hybrid workflow. So let's check those out real quick. So I think that's a really good starting point, because this is kind of the first comparison I did when I was testing the plugin as well. There's some really, really cool similarities between how I've set up my hybrid workflow here and how the Sidecar plugin is designed. So, you know, that's what appealed to me about the plugin. It's very similar to how I've set things up here. But at the end of the day, API summing aside, there's a lot of differences in the plugin too, and it offers a lot of additional options that, you know, even if I had more analog gear here, when I start throwing those into the equation, things start to become a lot more subjective than, you know, scientifically just trying to compare summing or something. So that's kind of the unfortunate reality of trying to demo a plugin like this that has so many cool things built in. When you start comparing it, a digital plugin, to a very extensive analog hybrid workflow, things get complicated and the results become very subjective. But I think at the very least, that shootout establishes that, hey, this plugin is totally capable of hanging with a very extensive and expensive hybrid analog digital workflow. So again, starting point, that's what I did starting out. I kind of ran things through the plugin, then I ran things through my hybrid setup and compared. So great results, good starting point. From here, I think the next logical step to go is to look at how the plugin sounds when it's pushed hard and how the plugin sounds when it's set up more clean. So we're going to have an example where things are pushed through the plugin harder. I've engaged the 8-channel summing option because it's a little more colorful. The compression and EQ are going to be the same on both examples, but then when we get to after the summing part to the analog stage and the line amp, I've chosen a different pair of converters for the clean section, and I've turned the line amp off as well for the clean example, and also kind of backed off on the input at the beginning too. So now we're just going to focus extensively on the plugin. We're just going to hear an example of the mix pushed and then flip back and forth to a clean example of Sidecar settings. So we got to hear the Sidecar on the mix bus compared to my kind of analog hybrid workflow in a few different configurations. We heard the mix bus in more of a cleaner setting compared to pushing it with some of the analog stuff turned on for a more colorful versus clean comparison. I think ending here, we should just hear the whole song front to back and hear the plug-in over the mix bus and then just bypass it a few times so you can hear exactly what it's doing, because I think ultimately what most of you are going to appreciate when you try this plug-in is that it'll end up replacing a lot of your plugins that you usually stack on your mix bus. You very well might be able to replace all those with just this one. And you'll probably see me start to do a lot more videos kind of focusing on some options that can replace a hybrid workflow like this, because I'm considering selling my API console. That's a whole nother story. It's not doom and gloom. It's just, you know, preferences and growing and being honest about how I want to work in the future and what works better for me after I've had the studio here for a few years. So this was a great way to kind of start that journey of, you know, considerations of things that can replace the console. And Sidecar did a great job. I'm definitely going to start using it a lot more. So let's take a look at the Sidecar in a full mix, and we'll just bypass it a few times so you can hear exactly what it's doing.
Maybe this is the end of the world. Maybe this is how Jesus comes back in cellular form. This is not a test of faith. This is how we show that we care. Six feet back, or 6 feet down. Call all your friends up, they're doing fine. These Benadryl dreams are blurring the lines. This will test how we show our love. Are you listening? Are you there? And do you care? May our paths cross, not today. Pick your poisons, shove 'em